My name is Richard Sullivan, and I'm retired. Used to be a judge, actually. Spent 30 years on the bench, handing down rulings, keeping order, making sure justice was served. Now I spend my days tending my tomatoes and zucchini in our little community garden. It's a peaceful life, or it was, until those developers showed up. It started with a flyer posted on the community bulletin board, a gaudy thing with pictures of gleaming high-rises and promises of luxury living. Luxury living for whom, I wondered? Certainly not for us. The flyer detailed plans to build a massive apartment complex right where our garden sits. Our garden, the one we built ourselves, brick by brick, seed by seed. The one that brings our whole neighborhood together. So we all crammed into the community hall for the meeting. Standing room only. Nerves were frayed, voices were raised. And then he walked in. Slick back hair, expensive suit, a smirk plastered on his face like he owned the place. Aaron Caldwell, the lawyer representing the developers. He launched into his spiel, all about progress and urban renewal. He talked like we were some backward bumpkins who couldn't appreciate the wonders of concrete and steel. I raised my hand, waited my turn, and when he finally acknowledged me, I calmly explained the importance of the garden to our community, how it provided fresh produce for families, how it was a place for children to learn about nature, how it was, simply put, our heart. Caldwell just sneered. He actually sneered at me. "Sir," he said, his voice dripping with condescension, "don't interrupt. We have a schedule to keep." That's when something inside me snapped. It wasn't just about the garden anymore. It was about the disrespect. The blatant disregard for me, for my community, for everything we held dear. This young pup, fresh out of law school, thought he could just waltz in here and dismiss us like we were nothing. He thought he could steamroll over us with his fancy words and his expensive suit. He had no idea who he was dealing with. He had no idea that the quiet old man he just dismissed had spent decades presiding over a courtroom, weighing evidence, dissecting arguments, and rendering judgments. He had no idea that I still possessed the sharp mind and strategic thinking of a seasoned judge. In that moment, sitting in that crowded, stuffy community hall, I made a decision. I wouldn't let them take our garden. I wouldn't let them get away with this. I would fight. And I would win. The seed of revenge, if you could call it that, had been planted. And I, Richard Sullivan, retired judge, was about to make sure it blossomed. My mind drifted back to the courtroom. The hushed silence as I entered, the rustle of gowns, the weight of the gavel in my hand. 30 years. 30 years I sat on that bench, listening to arguments, weighing evidence, making decisions that impacted people's lives. I'd seen it all, the good, the bad, the ugly. I'd presided over cases that made headlines, cases that tore families apart, cases that restored faith in humanity. I wasn't perfect, mind you. I'd made my share of mistakes. But I always strived to be fair, to be impartial, to uphold the law. I poured my heart and soul into that job. It wasn't just a career, it was a calling. It meant long hours, sleepless nights, sacrificing time with my family. My wife, bless her soul, understood. She knew how important it was to me. We both believed in the power of justice, in the importance of a fair and impartial legal system. And now, here I was, retired, tending my tomatoes, being treated like I was some senile old fool by a whippersnapper lawyer who probably hadn't even tried his first case yet. The memory of his condescending smirk burned in my mind. Don't interrupt. The arrogance. The sheer audacity. It felt like a slap in the face. Not just to me, but to my entire career, to everything I'd worked for. I remembered the faces of the people in the courtroom, the defendants, the plaintiffs, the witnesses. I remembered the weight of their stories, the burden of their hopes and fears. I had always tried to treat them with respect, with dignity, regardless of their circumstances. And now, this young lawyer, this Aaron Caldwell, was treating me, a retired judge, with the same dismissive contempt I'd seen directed at some of the most vulnerable people in society. It wasn't right, it wasn't fair, and I wouldn't stand for it. The gavel may have been replaced by a gardening trowel, the black robe by a worn-out flannel shirt, but the fire inside me, the passion for justice, hadn't diminished one bit. It had been banked, smoldering beneath the surface, waiting to be rekindled. And Caldwell, with his arrogance and his disrespect, had just struck the match. I walked through the garden, the late afternoon sun dappling through the leaves. The air was thick with the scent of ripe tomatoes and blooming basil. Bees buzzed lazily around the sunflowers, their fuzzy bodies dusted with pollen. It was a haven, a little slice of paradise tucked away in the middle of the city. I remembered the day we started it. A group of us, mostly retirees, decided we needed a place to grow our own food, a place to connect with nature, a place to build community. We'd cleared the lot ourselves, hauled away the debris, built the raised beds with our own hands. We shared seeds, seedlings, and gardening tips. We celebrated harvests with potlucks and picnics. The garden became more than just a place to grow vegetables. It became the heart of our neighborhood. Now they wanted to tear it all down, replace the vibrant green with cold, sterile concrete, replace the laughter of children with the roar of traffic, replace the scent of flowers with the stench of exhaust fumes. The thought made my stomach churn. I stopped by my tomato plants, their heavy branches laden with ripening fruit. I gently touched the smooth skin of a particularly large red tomato, the warmth of the sun radiating through it. This was more than just a garden. It was a symbol of our resilience, our community spirit. I thought about Mrs. Rodriguez, who lived across the street. She spent hours tending her herbs, using them to make traditional remedies for her grandchildren. I thought about Mr. Kim, who meticulously cared for his rows of bok choy, sharing the bounty with anyone who needed it. I thought about the children who came to the garden after school, their faces alight with wonder as they discovered the magic of growing things. What would they do if the garden was gone? Where would they go? Where would we go? The injustice of it all gnawed at me. It wasn't just about the garden itself. It was about the principle of the thing. It was about the right of a community to preserve its own little piece of paradise. It was about standing up to bullies who thought they could get away with anything just because they had money and power. The anger, which had been simmering beneath the surface, began to boil over. I clenched my fists, feeling the soil beneath my fingernails. I wouldn't let them win. I wouldn't let them destroy what we had built. I looked out at the garden, at the rows of vegetables, the buzzing bees, the dappled sunlight. This wasn't just a garden, it was a battleground. And I, Richard Sullivan, retired judge, was ready to fight. The anger started to recede, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. Grieving wouldn't save the garden. Outrage wouldn't stop the bulldozers. I needed a plan. And as I stood there, amidst the fragrant herbs and ripening vegetables, I realized I already had the tools I needed. They were the same tools I'd used for 30 years on the bench. A sharp mind, strategic thinking, and an unwavering commitment to justice. I'd spent my career analyzing complex cases, dissecting arguments, identifying weaknesses, and finding solutions. I'd dealt with powerful corporations, slick lawyers, and desperate individuals. I'd seen every trick in the book, and I'd learned how to counter them. This situation, this fight for our garden, was just another case, a different kind of courtroom, but the principles were the same. I needed to gather evidence, build a case, and present it in a way that would be impossible to ignore. I needed to understand my opponent, their motivations, their weaknesses. I needed to find their Achilles heel. And I needed to do it quickly. Caldwell's dismissive attitude, his arrogant smirk, now seemed less like an insult and more like a strategic error. He had underestimated me. He had dismissed me as a harmless old man, a relic of the past. He had no idea what I was capable of, and that, I realized, was my greatest advantage. I thought back to some of the most challenging cases I'd presided over, cases where the evidence seemed stacked against the underdog, where powerful interests tried to manipulate the system. I'd seen how persistence, careful planning, and a deep understanding of the law could level the playing field. I'd seen how justice, even when it seemed impossible, could prevail. A sense of purpose, a familiar feeling of control, began to settle over me. The fear and uncertainty I'd felt earlier were replaced by a quiet confidence. I was a judge, retired or not, and I knew how to fight. I walked back towards my house, the setting sun casting long shadows across the garden. The air was still filled with the scent of tomatoes and basil, but now, mingled with it, was the faint but distinct aroma of battle. I wasn't just a gardener anymore. I was a warrior, armed with the wisdom of experience and the unwavering resolve of a retired judge. And I was ready to go to war. The first thing I did was head down to the basement. It wasn't exactly a legal library down there, but I had kept a few key texts, the ones I'd referred to most often throughout my career. Dust motes danced in the dim light as I pulled down volumes on zoning regulations, environmental law, and property rights. My wife used to joke that those books were my most prized possessions, more valuable than any antique or family heirloom. She wasn't wrong. I spent the next few days poring over those books, my old reading glasses perched on my nose. The legal jargon, which had once been second nature, now felt a little rusty, like an old engine that needed cranking. But as I delved deeper, the familiar rhythms and logic of the law began to click back into place. It was like riding a bicycle. You never really forget. I focused on the zoning regulations for our neighborhood, looking for any loopholes, any inconsistencies, anything that might give us an edge. I also started researching the developers, a company called Apex Development Group. I knew nothing about them, but I figured there had to be something, some skeleton in their closet, that could be used to our advantage. The internet, a tool I'd never fully embraced during my years on the bench, now became my indispensable ally. I learned to navigate search engines, to sift through online databases, to follow digital trails. It was a new kind of investigation, a far cry from the paper files and courtroom testimonies I was used to, but the principles were the same. Gather information, analyze it, and find the truth. And I found it, or at least I found the beginning of it. Apex Development Group had a history, a long and checkered history. They'd been involved in several other projects around the city, all with a similar pattern. Promises of luxury living, aggressive tactics, and a disregard for community concerns. There were whispers of shady dealings, backroom agreements, and environmental violations. Nothing concrete, nothing I could use in a court of law, but enough to pique my interest. I discovered a particular project, a shopping mall built on a former wetland that had raised a lot of red flags. There had been protests, lawsuits, even a brief investigation by the city council. But somehow, Apex had managed to push the project through, silencing the opposition and escaping any serious consequences. I focused on this project, digging deeper, trying to understand how they'd managed to pull it off. I found old news articles, blog posts, and online forums where people had voiced their concerns. I even found a transcript of a city council meeting where residents had pleaded with the council to stop the project. Their pleas had been ignored. As I read through these documents, a pattern began to emerge. Apex Development Group wasn't just aggressive, they were reckless. They cut corners, ignored regulations, and bullied anyone who stood in their way, and they seemed to have a knack for getting away with it. But I also noticed something else, something more subtle, something that only a trained legal mind would pick up on. In their haste to push through their projects, they'd left a trail of breadcrumbs, small inconsistencies, minor violations, things that had been overlooked or dismissed at the time. These weren't enough to bring down the entire company, but they were enough to raise questions, to create doubt, to plant the seeds of suspicion. I closed my laptop, leaning back in my chair, a small smile playing on my lips. I had found my starting point. I had found the first crack in Apex Development Group's carefully constructed facade. And I knew, with a certainty that came from years of experience, that this was just the beginning. I knew I couldn't do this alone. Legal research was one thing, but I needed inside information, the kind you only get from whispers in the halls, from off-the-record conversations. I needed to tap into my network. Luckily, after 30 years on the bench, I had a pretty extensive one. I started with a few phone calls. Old colleagues, retired judges, lawyers I'd worked with over the years. I didn't reveal my full plan, just hinted that I was looking into Apex Development Group, doing a little digging for a, quote, personal project. Most were happy to chat, reminiscing about old cases, sharing anecdotes, and offering bits and pieces of information. Apex, huh? One retired judge, a gruff old fellow named Frank Miller, said over the phone. Heard they play rough, lots of money, lots of influence. Not afraid to bend the rules a bit, if you know what I mean. Another contact, a former prosecutor named Sarah Jenkins, told me about a case she'd handled years ago involving a subsidiary of Apex. They tried every trick in the book to get their client off, she said. Delay tactics, character assassination, you name it. Slimy bunch. These were just whispers, rumors, nothing I could use in a formal setting. But they painted a picture of a company that operated in the shadows, a company that wasn't afraid to get its hands dirty. Then I remembered David Chen, a bright young lawyer I'd mentored early in his career. He'd gone on to specialize in environmental law, making a name for himself as a fierce advocate for conservation. He owed me a favor or two, and I figured this was the time to call them in. David was as sharp as I remembered him. He listened intently as I explained the situation, the proposed development, the community garden, the arrogant young lawyer. He didn't interrupt, didn't offer platitudes. He just listened, his mind already working, strategizing. Apex, huh? He said when I was finished. I've crossed paths with them a few times. They're ruthless, but they're not invincible. David promised to do some digging of his own, to see what he could find on Aaron Caldwell and the development project. He had access to databases and legal resources that I didn't, and I knew he'd be thorough. Over the next few weeks, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. I learned that Aaron Caldwell, despite his youth, had a reputation for arrogance and a tendency to cut corners. He'd been reprimanded by the Bar Association for a minor ethical violation, and there were rumors of other, more serious infractions that had been swept under the rug. I also learned more about the development project itself. It seemed that Apex had rushed the environmental impact assessment, ignoring concerns raised by local residents and environmental groups. They'd also made some questionable claims about the project's economic benefits, inflating the numbers to make it seem more appealing to the city council. The more I learned, the more confident I became. Apex Development Group and their slick young lawyer weren't as untouchable as they thought. They had weaknesses, vulnerabilities, and I was determined to exploit them. The whispers in the halls, the off-the-record conversations, had provided me with the ammunition I needed. Now it was time to load the gun. It was a late Tuesday evening, rain lashing against the windows of my study, when David called. "Richard," he said, his voice hushed with a mixture of excitement and disbelief. "I think I've found it. Their Achilles heel." He went on to explain that while digging through old environmental reports, he'd stumbled upon something remarkable, something that had been buried, almost forgotten. Several years ago, in a different part of the state, Apex Development Group had been responsible for a significant environmental violation. They'd been fined, but the details of the incident had been kept quiet, swept under the rug, likely due to some backroom deal. It involved the illegal dumping of toxic waste near a protected wetland, and the resulting damage had been extensive. It was a big deal at the time, David explained, but it never really made the headlines. Apex managed to contain the damage, pay off the right people, and keep it all hushed up. But the records are there, buried in the State Environmental Agency's archives. He emailed me the Relais-Lake-Vaught documents, and I spent the next hour poring over them, my heart pounding with a mixture of anger and exhilaration. This was it. This was the smoking gun I'd been looking for. This was the evidence that could bring Apex Development Group to their knees. The violation was far more serious than anything I'd imagined. The amount of toxic waste dumped was staggering, and the long-term environmental consequences were still being felt. Apex had paid a paltry fine, a slap on the wrist compared to the damage they'd caused, and they'd managed to escape any real public scrutiny. This wasn't just about our community garden anymore. This was about holding a powerful corporation accountable for their actions. This was about exposing their greed, their recklessness, their disregard for the environment and the communities they impacted. I thought about the people who had been affected by the toxic waste dumping, the families whose lives had been disrupted, the ecosystems that had been damaged. I thought about the arrogance of Aaron Caldwell, his dismissive smirk, his condescending tone. He and his company had gotten away with it once, but they wouldn't get away with it again, not on my watch. I closed the file, a grim satisfaction settling over me. The rain continued to beat against the windows, the wind howling like a banshee. But inside my study, a calm had descended. I had found their weakness. I had found their Achilles heel, and now it was time to use it. The environmental violation was the key, the linchpin of my plan, but I knew I couldn't just waltz into a press conference and wave it around. I needed to build a case, a solid, airtight case, and I needed help. Luckily, I knew just who to call. First on my list was David, of course. He'd already proven invaluable with his research skills and his understanding of environmental law. He was young, energetic, and eager to take on a powerful corporation like Apex. He was also, importantly, discreet. I knew I could trust him to keep this quiet until the time was right. "David," I said when he answered the phone, "I think we need to have a serious conversation, and I think we need to bring in some reinforcements." He agreed without hesitation. My next call was to Patricia "Trish" O'Malley. Trish was a public relations expert, a force of nature who could spin a story better than anyone I knew. I'd met her years ago through a mutual friend, and I'd always been impressed by her sharp wit and her ability to command a room. She'd retired a few years back, but I had a feeling she wouldn't be able to resist a good fight. "Trish," I said when she picked up, "it's Richard Sullivan. Remember me? The retired judge with the green thumb?" She laughed. "Richard, of course I remember you. What can I do for you?" I gave her a brief overview of the situation, leaving out the juiciest details for now. Even over the phone, I could sense her interest peaking. "Sounds intriguing," she said. "Tell me more." We arranged to meet at a quiet cafe the next day. I brought David along, and the three of us huddled around a small table, the aroma of coffee and pastries mingling with the scent of impending battle. I laid out the whole story: the community garden, the arrogant young lawyer, the environmental violation. I showed them the documents David had uncovered, explaining the significance of the evidence. David, ever the pragmatist, outlined the legal strategy. We would file a lawsuit against Apex Development Group, citing the environmental violation as evidence of their reckless disregard for regulations. We would also demand a full and transparent investigation into their current development proposal. Trish, with her keen understanding of public perception, outlined the media strategy. We would leak the information about the environmental violation to a select group of journalists, ensuring that the story got maximum exposure. We would also organize a community rally, giving residents a platform to voice their concerns and put pressure on the city council. "We need to paint a picture," Trish said, her eyes gleaming with excitement. "A picture of a greedy corporation trying to bully a small community. A David and Goliath story. The public loves those." We spent the next few hours hashing out the details, assigning tasks, and setting deadlines. It felt like old times, like being back in the courtroom, strategizing with my legal team. The adrenaline was pumping, the wheels were turning, and I felt a surge of energy I hadn't felt in years. As we left the cafe, the rain had stopped, and a sliver of moon peeked through the clouds. I looked at David and Trish, their faces illuminated by the streetlights, and I knew I had assembled the right team. We were a motley crew: a retired judge, a young environmental lawyer, and a seasoned PR expert. But we were united by a common purpose, a shared sense of justice. And we were ready to take on Apex Development Group and their slick young lawyer. We were ready to fight for our garden, for our community, and for what was right. I'd always believed in the power of the press. During my time on the bench, I'd seen firsthand how a well-placed news story could sway public opinion, expose corruption, and bring powerful individuals to justice. Now it was time to use that power to our advantage. I contacted a local investigative journalist, a woman named Karen Miller, who had a reputation for tenacity and a nose for scandal. I'd met her a few times at community events, and I knew she was the kind of reporter who wouldn't shy away from a challenging story. I arranged to meet her at a quiet diner outside of town, a place where we could talk without being overheard. I brought along a folder containing copies of the documents David had uncovered, the evidence of Apex's environmental violation. "Karen," I said, sliding the folder across the table, "I think you'll find this interesting." She raised an eyebrow, her eyes scanning the documents. "Environmental violation, huh?" she said. "Apex Development Group. They're the ones trying to build that apartment complex, right? The one that's causing all the uproar in your neighborhood?" I nodded. "That's them. And this," I tapped the folder, "is just the tip of the iceberg." I didn't reveal my full plan, my connection to the community garden, or my history as a judge. I simply presented myself as a concerned citizen, someone who had stumbled upon some disturbing information and felt compelled to share it with the press. Karen listened intently as I explained the details of the violation, the extent of the damage, and the way Apex had managed to cover it up. She asked sharp, insightful questions, the kind of questions that told me she was taking this seriously. "This is big," she said, her eyes narrowing. "Really big. If this gets out, it could be devastating for Apex." "That's my hope," I said. She spent the next hour poring over the documents, taking notes, and asking more questions. I could see the wheels turning in her mind, the reporter's instinct kicking in. She knew she had a bombshell on her hands. "I need to verify this," she said finally. "Check my sources, do some digging of my own, but if this checks out, it's going to be front-page news." I left the diner feeling confident that Karen would do her job. She was a pro, and she knew a good story when she saw one. My next move was more subtle, more strategic. I anonymously contacted a member of the city council, a man named Councilman Ramirez, who had a reputation for integrity and a genuine concern for his constituents. I knew he'd been hesitant about the Apex Development Project, but he hadn't had any concrete reasons to oppose it, until now. I didn't reveal my identity, simply presenting myself as a concerned citizen who had some information about irregularities in the development proposal. I hinted at environmental concerns, questionable financial dealings, and backroom agreements. I didn't provide any concrete evidence, just enough to pique his interest, to plant the seeds of suspicion. "Councilman Ramirez," I said in a disguised voice, "I think you should take a closer look at the Apex Development Group proposal. There's more to it than meets the eye." I hung up before he could ask any questions, leaving him to wonder who I was and what I knew. I knew Councilman Ramirez was a meticulous man, a man who valued facts and evidence. He wouldn't act on rumors or innuendo, but he would investigate. He would start asking questions, digging deeper, looking for the truth. And when he did, he would find it. With the media and the city council now on the scent, the trap was set. All I had to do was wait. Wait for the pieces to fall into place. Wait for the dominoes to start toppling. It was a waiting game, a game of patience and strategy. And I, Richard Sullivan, retired judge, knew how to lay it. I went back to my garden, the setting sun casting long shadows across the rows of vegetables. The air was filled with the scent of basil and ripening tomatoes, a scent of peace and tranquility. But beneath the surface a storm was brewing. A storm of justice. A storm of righteous indignation. And I knew, with a certainty that came from years of experience, that Apex Development Group and their slick young lawyer were about to be caught in the middle of it. The pieces were in place. The trap was set. Now, all I had to do was wait. It was a strange feeling, this inactivity, after days of frantic research, phone calls, and strategizing. It reminded me of the quiet moments before a trial, the hushed anticipation in the courtroom, the knowledge that everything was about to change. I tried to go about my normal routine, tending my garden, reading the newspaper, chatting with my neighbors. But it was hard to focus. My mind kept racing, replaying the events of the past few weeks, anticipating the next move. I felt like a conductor who had just raised his baton, the orchestra poised, the music about to begin. I spent a lot of time in the garden during those days, finding solace in the familiar rhythms of nature. I weeded, watered, and harvested, my hands working in the soil, my mind working on the strategy. The garden had always been my sanctuary, a place of peace and tranquility. Now, it was also a source of strength, a reminder of what I was fighting for. I'd often find myself staring at the empty lot across the street, the site where Apex planned to build their monstrous apartment complex. I could almost see it rising before me, a concrete behemoth casting a shadow over our little community. But then I'd look back at my garden, at the vibrant green, the buzzing bees, the ripening vegetables, and I'd feel a surge of resolve. They wouldn't win. Not this time. The waiting was the hardest part. Every phone call, every news report, every conversation with my neighbors felt charged with anticipation. I knew something was about to happen, but I didn't know when or how. It was like waiting for a verdict, the jury out deliberating, the fate of the defendant hanging in the balance. I tried to keep busy, to distract myself from the gnawing anxiety. I baked bread, went for long walks, even tried my hand at a jigsaw puzzle, something I hadn't done in years. But nothing seemed to work. The tension was palpable, like a tightrope stretched taut, waiting to snap. One evening, I decided to revisit the community garden. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the rows of vegetables. The air was cool and crisp, the scent of autumn in the air. I walked slowly, taking it all in, the vibrant colors, the rustling leaves, the chirping crickets. I stopped by my tomato plants, their branches now bare, the last of the fruit harvested. I gently touched the dry, brittle stems, remembering the abundance of summer, the sweet, juicy tomatoes that had graced our table for months. I thought about my neighbors, their faces etched with worry and determination. I thought about Mrs. Rodriguez, Mr. Kim, the children who came to the garden after school. I thought about the community we had built, the bonds we had forged, the shared love for this little piece of paradise. I closed my eyes, taking a deep breath, the cool air filling my lungs. I could almost feel the victory, the sense of relief, the knowledge that we had won. I could see the garden thriving, the children laughing, the community celebrating. I opened my eyes, looking out at the garden, bathed in the soft glow of twilight. The calm before the storm. I knew it wouldn't last. The storm was coming, a storm of justice, a storm of righteous indignation. And I, Richard Sullivan, retired judge, was ready. I had planted the seeds, nurtured them, and now I was about to reap the harvest. It was a Sunday morning, peaceful and quiet. I was sitting on my porch, sipping my coffee and reading the newspaper, when my phone rang. It was Karen Miller, the journalist. "Richard," she said, her voice crackling with excitement. "Turn on your TV, Channel 5, now." I fumbled with the remote, my hands shaking slightly. There it was, splashed across the screen. Local developer accused of environmental cover-up. Below the headline, a picture of Aaron Caldwell, his slicked-back hair slightly disheveled, his usual smirk replaced by a look of stunned disbelief. Karen's report was thorough, meticulously researched, and devastatingly effective. She laid out the details of the environmental violation, the extent of the damage, the paltry fine Apex had paid, and the way they'd managed to keep it all quiet. She even included footage of the damaged wetland, the toxic sludge still visible beneath the surface of the water. It was damning evidence, the kind that couldn't be ignored. The report also mentioned the proposed development in our neighborhood, highlighting the community's concerns and the arrogant dismissal of those concerns by Aaron Caldwell. She even included a brief interview with me, identifying me only as a quote, concerned citizen, where I expressed my outrage at Apex's reckless disregard for the environment and the community. I watched the report in stunned silence, a sense of profound satisfaction washing over me. It was happening. My plan was working. The dominoes were starting to fall. Almost immediately, my phone started ringing off the hook. Neighbors, friends, colleagues, all wanting to know if I'd seen the news. The story was spreading like wildfire, fueled by social media and word of mouth. Public outcry was swift and furious. The local news channels picked up the story, running it on a continuous loop. Other newspapers and online news outlets followed suit, digging deeper, uncovering more details about Apex's shady dealings. The story was gaining national attention. Apex Development Group was becoming synonymous with corporate greed and environmental destruction. The city council, spurred by Councilman Ramirez's quiet investigation and the public outcry, announced an emergency meeting to discuss the Apex development proposal. The meeting was packed, standing room only, the atmosphere thick with tension and anger. I sat in the back watching the proceedings unfold. Aaron Caldwell was there, looking pale and flustered. His usual confidence shattered. He tried to defend his company, to downplay the environmental violation, to dismiss the public's concerns. But it was no use. The evidence was too damning, the public outrage too intense. Councilman Ramirez, his face grim, presented the findings of his investigation, highlighting irregularities in the development proposal, questionable financial dealings, and a pattern of disregard for community concerns. He called for a full and independent review of the project and demanded that Apex provide a detailed explanation of the environmental violation. The other council members, sensing the shift in public opinion, echoed his concerns. One by one, they voiced their opposition to the development project, citing the environmental risks, the community's objections, and the developer's lack of transparency. The gavel fell, figuratively speaking. The development project was put on hold indefinitely, pending the outcome of the investigation. The crowd erupted in cheers, a wave of relief and jubilation washing over the room. I slipped out quietly, unnoticed in the commotion. I didn't need to be there to witness the final act. I knew, with a certainty that came from years of experience, that the game was over. Apex Development Group had lost, and the community had won. The news hit Aaron Caldwell like a ton of bricks. 1 minute he was the rising star, the hotshot lawyer representing a powerful development company. The next, he was the face of corporate greed and environmental destruction. The arrogance that had been his trademark, the smirk that had so infuriated me and my neighbors, vanished, replaced by a look of stunned disbelief, then panic. The phone calls started almost immediately, a barrage of angry voices demanding explanations, apologies, resignations. His superiors at Apex Development Group were furious, blaming him for the public relations disaster, for the sudden and dramatic reversal of their fortunes. They'd been so close, so sure of their victory. Now, their carefully crafted plans were crumbling around them, their reputation tarnished, their future uncertain. The media was relentless, hounding him at every turn, cameras flashing, microphones thrust in his face, reporters shouting questions about the environmental violation, the shady dealings, the community's outrage. He'd been so used to controlling the narrative, to dictating the terms of engagement. Now he was the one being interrogated, the one on the defensive, the one struggling to keep up with the relentless tide of accusations. He tried to deflect, to deny, to downplay the significance of the evidence. He trotted out the usual corporate platitudes about responsible development and, quote, community engagement. But the words rang hollow, empty promises, in the face of the damning evidence that Karen Miller had unearthed. His carefully constructed facade of confidence began to crack, revealing the insecurity and inexperience that lay beneath. The city council's investigation added another layer of pressure. He was summoned to testify, forced to answer questions under oath about the development proposal, the environmental impact assessment, the financial projections. He'd always been adept at navigating the legal system, at manipulating the rules to his advantage. But this time was different. He was facing seasoned politicians, experienced investigators, and a public determined to hold him accountable. He stumbled, stammered, and contradicted himself, his carefully crafted arguments unraveling under the relentless scrutiny. The council members, once eager to embrace the promise of luxury living and economic growth, now viewed him with suspicion and disdain. He could feel their gazes, cold and unforgiving, boring into him, stripping away his veneer of confidence, exposing him for what he was, a young, ambitious lawyer who had overreached, who had underestimated his opponents, who had played a dangerous game and lost. The Bar Association also launched an investigation into his conduct, prompted by complaints from community members and the media reports about his unethical behavior. He'd been reprimanded before, a minor infraction that he'd easily brushed aside. But this time was different. The stakes were higher, the scrutiny more intense. He faced the possibility of disbarment, the end of his legal career, the shattering of his carefully constructed image. The pressure mounted, day after day, week after week. The phone calls, the emails, the news reports, the investigations. It was relentless, suffocating. He couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't think straight. The arrogance that had once been his shield, his weapon, now became his burden, a millstone around his neck, dragging him down into the depths of despair. He'd built his career on the belief that he was smarter, quicker, more cunning than everyone else. He'd thrived on the thrill of the win, the satisfaction of outmaneuvering his opponents. He'd never considered the possibility of losing, of being exposed, of being held accountable. Now he was facing the consequences of his actions, the consequences of his arrogance, the consequences of his hubris. The world he had so carefully constructed, the world of power, prestige, and privilege, was collapsing around him. And he, Aaron Caldwell, the rising star, the hotshot lawyer, was left standing amidst the ruins, alone, defeated, and utterly broken. The fallout for Apex Development Group was swift and brutal. The news of the environmental cover-up spread like wildfire, fueled by social media and the 24-hour news cycle. Their carefully crafted image of corporate responsibility shattered, replaced by a reputation for greed and recklessness. Their stock price plummeted, investors pulled out, and their future projects were put on hold. They'd gone from being a respected, if somewhat controversial development company, to a pariah, a symbol of everything that was wrong with corporate America. The public shaming was relentless. Protests erupted outside their corporate headquarters, demonstrators holding signs that read "Apex equals toxic" and "Justice for the community." Their social media accounts were bombarded with negative comments, angry emojis, and calls for boycotts. Every time they tried to issue a statement, to defend themselves, to control the narrative, they were met with a fresh wave of criticism and condemnation. They were drowning in a sea of bad press, their reputation sinking faster than a lead weight. The city council, once eager to embrace the promise of economic growth and luxury living, now distanced themselves from Apex as if they were radioactive. The development project in our neighborhood was officially canceled, the land designated as a permanent green space, protected from future development. Other cities, seeing the writing on the wall, began to reevaluate their own dealings with Apex, canceling contracts, launching investigations, and distancing themselves from the NTED company. The financial losses were staggering. Apex had poured millions of dollars into the development project, money that was now effectively down the drain. Their other projects stalled, their revenue streams dried up, and their creditors began to circle, sensing blood in the water. The once mighty Apex Development Group, the company that had seemed so invincible, so untouchable, was teetering on the brink of collapse. Aaron Caldwell's downfall was equally dramatic. He became the poster boy for corporate arrogance and unethical behavior. His picture, that same smirking image that had been plastered all over their promotional materials, now became a symbol of shame, a cautionary tale for ambitious young lawyers everywhere. He was formally reprimanded by the Bar Association, his reputation tarnished, his career prospects dimmed. He lost his job at the prestigious law firm he'd worked so hard to join, his colleagues distancing themselves from him, afraid of being tainted by association. He became a social outcast, shunned by his peers, mocked by the media, and vilified by the public. The arrogance that had once been his shield, his weapon, now became his albatross, a constant reminder of his spectacular fall from grace. The whispers in the halls, the ones that had once spoken of his brilliance, his cunning, his potential, now whispered of his downfall, his disgrace, his ruin. He'd built his career on the pursuit of power and prestige, on the belief that he was above the rules, that he could get away with anything. He'd learned the hard way that he was wrong, very wrong. The public shaming was complete. Apex Development Group and their slick young lawyer had been brought to their knees, not by brute force or legal maneuvering, but by the power of public opinion, the force of collective outrage. They had underestimated the community, underestimated the media, and most importantly, they had underestimated me. They had learned in the most painful way possible that even a retired judge, armed with nothing but his wits, his experience, and his unwavering commitment to justice, could be a formidable opponent. The news of Apex's downfall spread through our community like a warm summer breeze, a collective sigh of relief rippling through the streets, the gardens, and the homes. We'd won. David and Goliath, the little guys, the gardeners, the retirees, the families, had taken on a corporate giant and won. It felt exhilarating. The community celebrated. We had a potluck in the garden, the biggest one yet. Mrs. Rodriguez brought her famous tamales, Mr. Kim grilled Korean barbecue, and the kids ran around, their faces smeared with watermelon and ice cream. It felt like a festival, a celebration of community, of resilience, of victory. I was hailed as a local hero, the mastermind behind the whole operation. People patted me on the back, shook my hand, and thanked me for saving the garden. I tried to downplay my role, pointing out that it was a team effort, that David and Trish deserved just as much credit. But they wouldn't hear it. I was the retired judge, the wise old owl, the one who had outsmarted the slick lawyers and the corporate bullies. It felt good, I won't lie. After 30 years on the bench, I'd grown accustomed to a certain level of respect, a certain deference to my authority. But this was different. This wasn't about my title, my position, or my robe. This was about earning the respect of my community, about using my skills and experience to fight for something I believed in. The local newspaper ran a story about the victory, with a picture of me standing in the garden, a trowel in my hand, a smile on my face. The headline read, "Retired Judge Gardens His Way to Justice." My wife would have gotten a kick out of that. The city council, eager to capitalize on the positive publicity, officially designated the garden as a permanent community space, protected from future development. They even allocated funds for improvements, new benches, a composting system, and a small playground for the kids. The garden, once threatened with destruction, was now thriving, a symbol of community resilience and the power of collective action. Apex Development Group, meanwhile, was licking its wounds, trying to salvage what was left of its reputation. They issued a series of carefully worded apologies, promising to learn from their mistakes and, quote, commit to responsible development. But the damage was done. The public trust was broken, and their brand was tarnished beyond repair. They were forced to abandon several other projects, their investors wary, their creditors circling. Their financial losses were substantial, a fitting punishment for their greed and recklessness. Aaron Caldwell, the young lawyer who had sneered at me, who had dismissed our concerns with such arrogance, disappeared from the public eye. Rumor had it he'd left town, his legal career in shambles, his reputation in tatters. I didn't gloat, not outwardly, but I admit there was a certain satisfaction in knowing that he'd been brought down a peg or two, that he'd learned a valuable lesson about humility and respect. The victory was sweet, sweeter than any tomato I'd ever grown. It was a victory not just for our community, but for everyone who had ever been bullied by a powerful corporation, for everyone who had ever felt powerless in the face of injustice. It was a victory for the little guys, the underdogs, the ones who dared to stand up and fight for what they believed in. And it was a victory that had been orchestrated, not by a powerful lawyer or a wealthy corporation, but by a retired judge, armed with nothing but his wits, his experience, and his unwavering commitment to justice. A retired judge who, in his retirement, had rediscovered his purpose, his passion, and his power. Months passed. The dust settled. Life returned to a new normal, a normal that included a guaranteed future for our little patch of green. The community garden flourished. New plants sprang up, replacing the withered stalks of summer's bounty. Fall brought a riot of colors: fiery red peppers, deep orange pumpkins, and vibrant yellow squash. The air, once thick with the scent of impending battle, now carried the sweet fragrance of chrysanthemums and the earthy aroma of decaying leaves. I spent hours in the garden, tending my plot, watching the seasons change, enjoying the quiet satisfaction of a job well done. The tomatoes were gone, replaced by rows of winter greens, kale, spinach, and chard, their dark leaves a welcome splash of color against the muted browns and grays of late autumn. Mrs. Rodriguez's herb garden was still going strong, rosemary, thyme, and sage thriving in the cooler weather. She'd often bring me small bundles of freshly cut herbs, her wrinkled hands warm and calloused from years of working the soil. We'd sit on the bench, sipping tea and chatting about the garden, the weather, and the latest gossip from the neighborhood. Mr. Kim's bok choy had been replaced by rows of garlic and onions, their pungent aroma filling the air. He'd often invite me to share his kimchi, a spicy fermented cabbage dish that was both delicious and surprisingly addictive. The children still came to the garden after school, their laughter echoing through the crisp autumn air. They helped rake leaves, plant bulbs, and build birdhouses, their small hands busy, their faces alight with wonder. The garden had become a classroom, a playground, and a sanctuary, a place where they could connect with nature, learn about the cycles of life, and build community. The new benches, funded by the city council, were a welcome addition, providing a comfortable place to rest and enjoy the beauty of the garden. The composting system was also a success, turning kitchen scraps and yard waste into rich, fertile soil, a constant reminder of the power of renewal and regeneration. The small playground, tucked away in a corner of the garden, was a constant source of joy for the children. Swings swayed, slides gleamed, and laughter filled the air, a testament to the garden's ability to nurture not just plants, but also the spirits of the young. I often found myself sitting on one of the benches, watching the children play, listening to the birds sing, and breathing in the fresh, clean air. It was a peaceful, fulfilling existence, a far cry from the stress and tension of the courtroom. I'd traded my gavel for a trowel, my black robe for a worn-out flannel shirt, and the hushed silence of the courtroom for the cheerful chatter of children and the gentle hum of bees. I'd learned a valuable lesson during those tumultuous months, a lesson about the importance of standing up for what is right, even in retirement. I'd learned that age doesn't diminish passion, that experience can be a powerful weapon, and that even a retired judge, armed with nothing but his wits and his determination, can make a difference. I'd also learned the importance of community, the power of collective action, and the strength that comes from working together towards a common goal. The garden, once a source of personal solace, had become a symbol of our shared resilience, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit. As the days grew shorter and the nights grew colder, I'd often find myself thinking back to that fateful community meeting, to the arrogant young lawyer, the condescending smirk, and the words that had sparked my resolve. Don't interrupt. I smiled to myself, a quiet, knowing smile. He'd learned the hard way that sometimes interrupting is exactly what needs to be done. Sometimes it's the only way to make your voice heard, to stand up for what you believe in, and to ensure that justice, even in a small community garden, prevails. The garden thrived, a testament to that simple truth. I look out at you all now, and I see a lot of folks who probably think their fighting days are behind them. You've put in your time, earned your rest, and you're entitled to it. But I'm here to tell you something. Don't let anyone, especially some hotshot young whippersnapper, tell you you're irrelevant. Don't let them dismiss you, disregard you, or disrespect you. You've got a lifetime of experience, a wealth of knowledge, and a strength of character that they can't even begin to comprehend. Never underestimate the wisdom and resolve of a retired judge. We may be out of the courtroom, but we still know how to fight for justice. We know how to analyze a situation, identify weaknesses, and build a case. We know how to use the law, the media, and the power of public opinion to our advantage. We may not wear the robes anymore, but we still carry the gavel, figuratively speaking, in our hearts. And we're not afraid to use it. We've seen it all, heard it all, and judged it all. We've dealt with the best and the worst of humanity, and we've learned a thing or two along the way. We know how to stand up to bullies, how to expose corruption, and how to fight for what's right. So the next time someone tries to tell you you're too old, too slow, too out of touch, remember my story. Remember the community garden, the arrogant young lawyer, and the retired judge who wouldn't back down. Remember that even in retirement, you still have a voice, you still have power, and you still have the ability to make a difference. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Don't let them silence you. Don't let them win. Stand up for what you believe in. Fight for your community. Fight for justice. And never, ever underestimate the power of a retired judge with a green thumb and a thirst for justice. Now, if you enjoyed this story about an underestimated elder getting his righteous revenge, I encourage you to subscribe to Retirement Stories for more tales just like it. We've got a whole community of feisty retirees ready to share their stories, their wisdom, and their fighting spirit. Subscribe now and join the revolution.